Hello and welcome to the Wires podcast. My name is Kabir Agarwal, and today we will be talking about the impact of the COVID induced lockdown on the agriculture economy. The agriculture sector has seen a significant downturn in the last few years. In fact, according to the government's own household consumption expenditure survey, as reported by Sumesh Jha of the Business Standard, spending by rural households declined by almost 10% between 2011 and 2017. This has been caused in large part by stagnant or declining prices of agriculture produce. And just as prices were beginning to pick up, COVID struck and the lockdown was imposed, further and once again throwing this economy into disarray. To talk about this, we have with us Siraj Hussain, former Secretary of the Union Agriculture Ministry. Welcome, Siraj Saab. Let's start by talking about what you see are the broad impacts of the lockdown on the agriculture sector.
Some parts of rural economy have been very badly affected. For example, the growers of fruits and vegetables have had to sell their produce at throwaway prices. Similarly, milk producers have been very adversely affected. Milk prices have gone down by about 25% to about 35% in various parts of India. And poultry producers were already in doldrums even before the lockdown came. Actually, because of the fake news over WhatsApp, many people started avoiding poultry products as WhatsApp messages were circulating that they cause COVID-19. So several sectors of agricultural economy were very badly impacted by the lockdown.
But would you say that there were also some bright spots as wheat procurement perhaps in Punjab and Haryana has happened quite reasonably well given the situation?
Yes, in fact, the officers engaged in procurement of wheat in Punjab, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh have to be complimented. In Punjab, the procurement has reached about 12 million tons. In Haryana, it has reached 6.4 million tons. In Madhya Pradesh, it has reached a very high level of 7.8 million tons. So in these states, the wheat farmers have been able to get the minimum support price fixed by the government. In UP, however, procurement is 1.4 million tons, and we do not know whether it will reach the targeted level of about 5 million tons, which was achieved 2 years back. Last year, the procurement was 3.7 million tons, but in 2018-19, UP had achieved more than 5 million tons. So we do not know what is the impact of wheat procurement, impact of lockdown on wheat procurement, especially in eastern states. Wire had done a story on that. So I think
Correct.
you know it better what is happening on the ground in UP.
No, nobody knows it better than you. But we had reported that the procurement in UP is only about 17-18% of the targeted procurement. And and some of the centers in some regions are not operating as one would expect them to operate. So I'd also just, if you could explain a little bit that why do these regional differences appear, right? Like why, for instance, we have procurement facilities in Punjab and Haryana which operate quite well. But on the other hand, in UP and in Bihar, they don't quite work that well. Why are these differences there?
Actually, in Punjab and Haryana, the procurement machinery is very well organized for several decades. And the level of taxation in Punjab and Haryana was about 14% before the GST came. So there were no private buyers operating in mandis in Punjab and Haryana. The government agencies were buying everything. So it was very well organized and the farmers knew what to do. The mandis knew how to procure, how to bag, how to transport it to various storage points, etc. The success story of the last decade is actually Madhya Pradesh in case of wheat, and Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, and Chhattisgarh in case of rice. In these states, procurement was very low before the food crisis of 2005-6. It was only after that that Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana have been able to organize their procurement operations, and now we find that they are almost as well organized as Punjab and Haryana. In fact, in certain respects, they are better organized because in Madhya Pradesh, the procurement is not through commission agents. The procurement is through the cooperative societies. So the point is that if a state has the will, it can do it.
Right. So, just to talk a little bit more about this, what are some of the infrastructural tools that are required to have a efficient procurement machinery? What are some of the things that a state needs in place, like which are in place in Punjab, Haryana, and Madhya Pradesh, like you said?
The first thing is the intent of the state government that it will organize the procurement operations. So for that, you need manpower, first of all. Then you need procurement agencies which have a sufficient amount of working capital. Then you have the storage capacity, which is already existing in Uttar Pradesh also. Madhya Pradesh is already existing. In Bihar also now the storage capacity has been augmented, but it is much less than the requirement. So working capital, storage capacity, manpower, and the will on the part of the state government to organize the operations. If these things are there, then as we have seen in these states, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, etc., it can be done. So far, unfortunately, Bihar has not shown that kind of will, as a result of which last year the wheat procurement in Bihar was just about 18,000 tons, and this year so far it is only about 3,000 tons.
Right. So, going back to some of your experience as a top bureaucrat, so what were some of the major challenges that you faced as a bureaucrat in times of crisis in getting the agriculture economy working or saving it from a crisis?
Actually, I have seen both the shortage economy and the surplus economy. So in 2005-6, wheat production fell down, as a result of which the procurement also went down very substantially. In fact, on 1st April 2006, we had just about 2 million tons of wheat in the government stock, while the buffer norm for 1st of April at that time was 4 million tons. So we had only half of the buffer stock norm, and
That
therefore
that is quite that is quite remarkable because the buffer stock norm now is around 21 million tons.
the buffer stock norm has been revised after that, but you are adding both wheat and rice. I'm only talking
Oh,
of wheat.
yeah. Okay.
So in case of wheat, we had only half of the buffer norm, and therefore India had to import some 5.5 million tons of wheat. So I've seen that. I've also seen the surplus years, 2010 to 2012, in the Food Corporation of India, and even before that in Uttar Pradesh. So both surplus and deficits are very difficult to manage. In fact, procurement is a very complex operation, and that is why when people say that India should procure all the commodities in all the states, I keep saying that it is neither feasible nor desirable, because it needs huge amount of investment, both financial investment and manpower investment, and even then there are several problems in logistics which are faced by the government. So this success in wheat and rice cannot really be replicated for all other commodities.
And you also said that it would not be desirable. So, meaning that if it was feasible, it would still not be desirable. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
See, we have seen that even in case of wheat and rice, very high levels of procurement uh, drive away the private trade. So what happens is that then the government ends up buying much more than its own requirement of PDS. As a result of that, the government has to carry very high carrying cost of the stock, and many a times we do not know, the government does not know what to do with that stock. Before the COVID crisis came, we had been writing that this year the government will face enormous problem of shortage of storage capacity, because the wheat stocks are going to be some 3 times the buffer stock norm. We have seen in case of pulses where NAFED has procured stocks in the last 3 years after the creation of buffer stock in 2016. The government decided to create a buffer stock of 2 million tons of pulses in 2016. We have seen that government does not know how to dispose of that stock. So whenever government, that means NEFET, sells the stock in the open market, the prices go down. Therefore, it would not be desirable for the government to undertake procurement of all the 23, 24 commodities for which MSP is declared.
Correct. So, summarizing, would you say that given that we are almost into 2 months now of the lockdown, would you say that this is sort of a success story, especially for wheat and rice in terms of India's MSP regime? Is this a success? Is this an example that is a robust mechanism just for wheat and rice?
Yes, in case of wheat, our procurement is reaching 28.4 million tons, which is a great achievement. And I must compliment the procurement machinery of Punjab, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, particularly, but also Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh, where despite all the handicaps, they have been able to buy, they have been able to pack it in the gunny bags. And then when there was shortage of gunny bags, the government of India permitted use of second-hand used gunnies. Also, plus permission was given for using HDP plastic bags. Then the government had to organize lifting from mandis and transportation to godowns. Railways had to move much higher quantity of wheat and rice from Punjab to other states so as to create a space for storage. Very complex operation, but very well done. So we must compliment, and the country must be proud of the procurement machinery in these states.
Right. So now moving on to a situation where of vegetable and fruit growers and flower growers particularly who have suffered because of a crash in prices and also a decline in demand. How do you see that problem, and was there anything that the government could have done to sort of limit the impact on these farmers?
Actually, that was very unfortunate because the government of India, the Ministry of Home Affairs, in the guidelines they issued as early as 27th, 28th of March, they clarified that there should be no restriction on movement of foodstuff. If that guideline was followed by all the states, and if the operation of mandis was allowed to be smooth, remain smooth, then we would not have seen the kind of transportation bottlenecks which were seen across India. The transporters were beaten up, farmers were beaten up by police, mandis were not allowed to function, as a result of which the prices crashed for many fresh produce grown by farmers. They were very disturbing images of farmers destroying their own crops. Same thing happened in case of milk, where the prices fell down. The consumption of flowers went down substantially because of the lockdown. So the farmers had to destroy their standing crop of flowers. So it was very disturbing to see those images. Now you are asking what the government could have done. Probably, if first of all the bandis had functioned efficiently, maybe we would have seen less of these problems. And secondly, at the district level and at the level of the commissionerate, if the district level officers and the officers of agriculture department had jointly collaborated with the NGOs, then perhaps the NGOs could have bought some of this fresh produce and transported it and supplied it to needy people. But somehow that did not happen. I had written, for example, that the government should trust the NGOs and give them free rice till the lockdown is there, so that they can uh, provide cooked food to at least 1 crore people, migrant, workers who were stranded, etc., and other needy people. But somehow that did not happen.
Okay, so also was part of the reason that there was a lack of clarity coming from New Delhi, that there were clarifications after clarification, there was no clear guidelines on how this is supposed to operate, who is allowed to travel, who is not allowed to travel, what is essential and what is not essential. Was that a part of the problem?
Actually, the guidelines, of course, were revised many a times, but it is, I would not blame the Union Home Ministry for that. They were not implemented uniformly by the states. However, if only the guidelines were explained at a more senior level from the union government, let us say the Home Minister of India, or at least the Cabinet Secretary of India, then perhaps the state level officers at the district level, the senior superintendent of police, the district magistrates would have perhaps understood the guidelines better. So what was happening was that this issue was being treated only as a health issue, and it was only a joint secretary of the health ministry who was communicating to the country about what is being done. So it was not only a health issue from the very beginning, it was an economic issue, it was a sociological issue, and it had many ramifications. So somehow that was not done, as a result of which all this confusion continued across India. uh, Everybody, at the district level was interpreting the guidelines in her own manner.
But you're saying that the guidelines, an explanation to what the guidelines mean, coming from somebody like the Home Minister would have helped.
Yes, because then the district magistrates would have understood that the center does not want any restriction on movement of agricultural produce. The
Right.
center said it in its various communications starting from late March. Then ICAR came up with very clear guidelines. Department of Agriculture also issued guidelines to chief secretaries, but they were perhaps not understood at the district level. And secondly, perhaps they were not, it needed to be explained in some detail so that the person who is actually there on the road checking the movement by trucks, etc., understood what is the intent of the government.
So as a result of this, we've seen that vegetable growers, fruit growers, and flower growers have suffered immensely. What do you think would be like? Do we have estimates of what kind of losses they have suffered? How long will they take to get back on their feet? Or would these be sort of long-lasting losses that they have suffered?
I do not think there is any estimate of losses suffered, but I do feel that there is a very strong need to compensate them by way of direct benefit transfer. Of course, now many media channels are saying that the direct benefit transfer is a bribe. In fact, on one channel, I heard the anchor say that it is goose, and this government does not believe in giving doles to people. So I think many people are getting it very wrong. Sections of media are also getting it very wrong. The government should compensate selectively the sections of farming community who have suffered more. So, for example, I am not suggesting that the farmers of wheat in Punjab, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, etc., who have realized MSP need to be compensated. No, but the farmers who grow vegetables or poultry farmers, etc., they do need to be compensated.
And what could be the mechanism to compensate them?
That is not easy. That is quite complicated. But I think if the intent is there, our very bright youngsters who use the IT tools, they can find a way out. So, for example, in mandis, there would be a record of farmers who bring their vegetables. Similarly, the farmers who have been given grant under various schemes of National Horticulture Mission, or in case of milk, the milk producers who sell to cooperative societies. So their records are all available with the government. Of course, the cooperative societies have not reduced the price of milk. Others have. So, many of them would have taken loans from bank. I'm not saying it is very easy. I do realize it is difficult, but then it needs to be done.
What about the mechanism which has often been talked about, like you spoke about the tech people who've all often spoken about the jam trinity, Jandhan, Aadhaar, and mobile. This government has been particularly keen and has said that is sort of the solution to many of the problems of India's most vulnerable. but we haven't seen a lot of use of that in this crisis. Do you think that the government doesn't trust that system enough, or what are the problems there?
I think the infrastructure in case of IT backbone and linkage with bank accounts is present. But I think the government has been reluctant, perhaps due to the fiscal constraints. Otherwise, I see no reason for not using the DBT Trinity, which has been written about in economic surveys one after the other, and the government has taken a lot of credit for that, rightly so. That credit is definitely due to the government, this government, but they have not used it, perhaps because of fiscal constraints, and also, I hope I am wrong, uh, this creeping thing, this ideological thing that the society must take care of its poor rather than the government. So I hope I am wrong, but I do get a feeling from TV channels that that is the narrative they want to communicate.
Can you expand a little bit on that? You spoke about how TV anchors have been calling schemes like PM Kisan, even bribes to bribes to voters, perhaps, or I'm not sure what they mean by bribes. Like there is a quid pro quo in a bribe, but what is the quid pro quo here? I'm not sure. But would you say that this is a general sentiment that is coming from the home of a certain ideology, that schemes such as PM Kisan or any form of cash transfer is not called for, and instead we would be empowering people, which is something that Nirmala Sitaraman also said, that empowerment versus entitlement. So, where do you stand on that ideological front?
I do not know if any anchor called PM Kisan a bribe, but uh,
No, I
dole,
meant
that is the word.
schemes like PM Kisan, but that is the best example of a benefit transfer scheme right now.
But I did not hear any anchor say that PM Kisan was a bribe, but generally speaking, they were saying that this government does not believe in doles and all that, meaning thereby that no one should expect a cash transfer. The several leading economists, Indian economists, as well as others like Mr. Piketty, have been advocating cash transfers to most vulnerable sections of our population, but that has not been accepted by the government. My own view is that we do need to put money in the hands of people, the most deserving people. I do realize that it is quite difficult, extremely difficult to identify them, but we should make a beginning somewhere, uh, and transfer some money to them so that people can survive for the next 3 months or so till they find alternative employment. As you know, the images on TV are showing millions of people have been dislocated. They want to go back to their villages. They have lost their income, lost their jobs, and therefore there I thought there is a need to give some money in their hands. Of course, identification problems remain in their place. For that, one has to separately discuss the various alternatives which are available. For example, one alternative which I have been thinking about is whether the government can identify Jan Dhan accounts which never had a credit balance of more than 20,000 rupees since the opening of the account. So
Right.
this means that these accounts have not been used during demonetization by unscrupulous elements. It means that these people have very little surplus and therefore they are deserving. So things like this, I'm not saying this is the solution, but various alternatives should be considered. Odisha has a good experience of transferring money under PM Kalia to landless agriculture labor and tenant farmers. So perhaps inputs should be taken from the Secretary Agriculture, Government of Odisha.
Right. So, so on with universal basic income, for example, that's an idea which has been discussed for some time now, particularly in the context of the West, not so much in India. So, I mean, just to explain to those who are listening, What are the problems with implementing UPI in India? Is it primarily the fiscal problem that since we have such a large population that it would cost too much to give any meaningful amount to all people?
Actually, most people who have written about it, the economists, they have acknowledged that it has to be a targeted UBI in India and not a universal transfer of money. So obviously, the country cannot afford a universal transfer of money, but some money in the hands of people, especially during this period of extreme economic insecurity and loss of income, was very much needed. Somehow, it seems that the economists working in the government were not convinced, and or perhaps they could not persuade the political masters to undertake any direct benefit transfer. But I think it is up to the academicians and researchers to come out with various alternatives for giving money directly in the hands of people. Because today or tomorrow, this will have to come. For example, as we discussed in the beginning of this program, the government is in no position to undertake procurement of all the crops at MSP. Therefore, some kind of income support is required to be given to those whose crops are not procured. So, which means this will exclude the farmers of wheat and paddy and sugarcane who do get a fair price, but others who do not grow these crops, they will get some amount. Now, these things need to be further expanded, researched, written about, and I think it is up to our economists and researchers to come out with various alternatives which can be considered by the government.
Correct, correct. So, having set this context, how do you see the reforms and the so-called financial package which the finance minister has recently announced over the last week, which includes a number of steps taken for the agriculture sector? Now, most of those schemes were existing schemes which have either been given additional money or additional impetus. But there were three key reforms with regards to the agriculture sector, which economists and a lot of uh, activists and watchers of the agriculture sector had been asking for decades, saying that the agriculture sector needs to be freed of the clutches of the Essential Commodities Act, the APMC Act, and to allow contract farming. Now, the government has said that it is keen to do those reforms now, that it will be implementing those reforms. Um, Ashok Gulati, perhaps India's foremost agriculture economist, has praised these reforms and said that these are a step in the right direction. We have to wait for the fine print, but in principle, these decisions are good. What is your view on these reforms?
Of course, I have already written about it. These are very good decisions, and they are long overdue, especially the decisions relating to marketing. So we have seen from time to time state governments imposing restrictions on movement of various agricultural items outside the state. Sometimes the restrictions are imposed on movement even within the state. Stock restrictions are stock limits are suddenly imposed. In case of onion, for example, we have seen how these stock limits were reduced a number of times after October. So I see that there is going to be a way forward in liberalizing the agricultural markets and in creating competition. As far as EC Act is concerned, I think it is going to be quite a task for the officers in the government who are drafting the act. The reason is that these surpluses in India are very marginal, and therefore from time to time we see price hikes. So, for example, if the monsoon this year is deficient in the country or in some parts of India, we may see a price rise. I do not know how the government will draft the Essential Commodities Act in such a manner that it will still retain the leeway to intervene. So it is quite complex actually, and that is why these announcements have been made by political parties for several years. They have found place in the manifestos of various political parties during elections, but they have not been able to actually implement it. So we will wait for the actual draft of the law before making any detailed comments about what is in store.
And for example, speaking of the problem that you mentioned with price volatility, uh, Ramesh Chandra of the Niti Aayog has said that these price increases will still have to be capped at 100% year on year. And based on that, Roshan Kishore of Hindustan Times has done an analysis that in the last 69 months, in the last 120 months, I'm sorry, the government would have had to intervene 69 times based on that 100% cap. So that would not mean much for the reform, would it?
Actually, as far as I know, there is no final shape to the new Essential Commodities Act or the amendments in the Act. I suppose the government would examine various aspects of it in consultation with the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, which is responsible for monitoring the prices. Uh, it is not going to be easy. We must remember that a very fine balance has to be maintained between encouraging the farmers to get a fair price, permitting them, enabling them to get a fair price, and um, allowing the system to function in such a manner that there is no undue holding or manipulation of stocks by the private trade. So the government will strive to maintain or achieve a fine balance. It is quite difficult. I fully acknowledge that.
Okay. So moving on to food security, a lot of people have spoken of the need to universalize the public distribution system in the face of this crisis. As it is, about 800 million people in India are covered by the National Food Security Act. Based on a calculation done by John Reyes, Ritika Khera, and Meghna Mungikar, about 100 million people are left out. 108 million people are left out just because the population that is used to calculate the number of people covered by the NFSA is the 2011 population, and India's population has increased after that. So 108 million people are left out just on that basis. And also, additionally, now because of a loss of livelihood, many more millions of people would now be vulnerable in the sense of food security. So, what would you say needs to be done or needed to be done right in the beginning? Has the government done enough on food security?
I think the government did a good job initially by saying that food grains will be supplied free to the ration card holders for 3 months. So that was a good decision. And recently, this decision has come to give free PDS grains to another 8 crore people. Of course, the identification is going to be difficult. See, the problem is that a universal PDS at the current rate of rupees 2 for wheat and rupees 3 for rice, in my view, is not sustainable. And I think it is not desirable also because it results in leakage and misuse of PDS grains, which are highly subsidized. Therefore, I had written that in view of the distress, it may perhaps be easier for the government to universalize the PDS for some time, let us say 2 or 3 months. Anybody can come to a fair price shop, get the grains, but then she should be willing to pay half of the MSP. So that I thought would bring only the deserving to the fair price shop, and um, the better off sections of society would not like to come in and stand in a queue for subsidized wheat or rice, but not as highly subsidized at the current level, 2 rupees and 3 rupees. So,
So you
see,
are
we
saying
must
that
remember,
this suggestion would be for those who do not hold ration cards.
right.
Okay, so would you think that they would have given that perhaps they would not have earned any money for the last 2 months? Would they have the paying capacity to do this, to buy grain?
No, it is quite clear that some kind of direct cash assistance would be required to be given. So, it would not be a very good policy, in my view, to give such highly subsidized grains uh, to everyone. It is not sustainable, and also we must remember that procurement is a very complex operation. Storage is very difficult, very expensive for the government, and it is also possible that this year we may procure just about 30 million tons of wheat against some estimates of 40 million tons. So the government also has to take a longer term view and keep in mind future disruptions in supply, in procurement, the rainfall, the possibility of drought, etc. Calamities may come. So governments have to rightly be quite prudent in the management of their food grains.
So this is despite like the government as of March held 77 million tons of grain, which is a record stock. So a lot of people have said that if this stock of grain is not used, and this is perhaps the kind of crisis that you have buffer stocks for, then for one, these will the grains will just rot and they will be wasted instead of feeding people who are hungry.
No, 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 this wastage thing is all wrong. The losses of FCI are less than 0.1%. So FCI management of grains is quite good. But that is not the issue. The issue is that those who are most deserving should definitely get the subsidized grains. Who are not so deserving should also be given grains during this period of COVID induced economic distress. But in order to keep the um, grain management within manageable limits and to avoid the leakage and misuse of highly subsidized grains, a higher price should be charged from them. Please remember that before the enactment of National Food Security Act, the the central issue price used to be much higher. So the APL price used to be 8 rupees, 15 paisa for rice and 6 rupees 40 paisa for wheat. So the NFSA brought the issue prices down, and um, I do not think it is sustainable to have a universal PDS at the current issue price.
Okay, so the again, this is one of the issues of the economic cost of FCI holding the stock, which is around 37 rupees for per kilogram for rice and 27 or 28 for wheat. Could you explain a little bit on that? Then why is the economic cost of wheat and rice higher than the market price of both of these?
No, there are several reasons for that. First of all, uh, if the FCI or the government agencies purchase wheat and rice in Punjab, for example, they pay 8.5% tax. The private trade, would be avoiding these taxes. Um, Secondly, the government owes a lot of money, some 3 lakh crores to FCI for the dues of the previous years. So the interest on that also adds up. Now, the difficulty is that the private trade is not able to is able to operate cheaply because they do not use very high cost storage godowns. Their storage is very rudimentary many a times. Their manpower costs are not so high. So all these things add up to the economic cost, and therefore we find that the economic cost of FCI is higher.
Correct.
And that is why we say that government should not be procuring all the commodities, because, for example, we do not know the economic cost of pulses. Now everybody is saying that government should distribute pulses across India. I think it is not a viable option. It will be very expensive for the government to distribute pulses across India. A much more economical option for the government, if they want to give pulses under PDS, would be to allow the state governments to buy from the open market and distribute.
Correct. That would cost less.
Yes.
Okay, so just to wind up, what do you see? How do you see the agriculture sector panning out in the next sort of 1 year? How do you see it coming out relatively unscathed as compared to other sectors? Uh, or how do you also see the kind of damages that we are looking at in other sectors?
I think if the monsoon is not deficient, the IMD is predicting a normal monsoon. If the monsoon is not deficient, we will have a good Kharif crop, and that will also facilitate good soil moisture for Rabi crop. So I do expect that this projection of some 3.5% growth in agricultural GDP will be achieved. Obviously, agriculture has not been damaged as much as other sectors of economy. So it is true that my expectation of agriculture sector is much better than the expectation from other sectors of economy.
Okay, on that positive and hopeful note, we'll wind up. Thanks a lot, Siraj sir, for joining us and for this enlightening conversation. Stay safe and stay healthy.